Device inverted. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been built to escort heavy bombers at altitude, until 9th Air Force groups turned it into a low-flying train hunter, and Luftwaffe rail movement doctrine fractured in weeks. Subscribe for new, forensic World War II investigations every day. Dawn broke cold over the Kiel River on the 5th of March, 1944. Frost lay in ribbons along the Gerolstein-Oskirchen line, and steam hung over a string of covered wagons idling beneath the firs. At 0740, the old rule still held. Railways moved at first light under broken cloud, trusting distance from the Channel coast and winter haze to screen them from fighter sweeps. At 0752, that rule failed. At 04, P-47s from a 9th Air Force group came in under the cloud shelf at roughly 200 meters, line abreast, and turned the valley into a gunnery lane. Witnesses on the ground later marked 2 passes. Aircraft cameras recorded 3. Within a minute, the locomotive's tender bled steam, the consist buckled across frost-stiffened ballast, and black smoke folded into the trees. The surprise mechanic was simple and ruthless. Massed, low-altitude 50-caliber fire delivered from stout airframes that could absorb light flak, flown in coordinated elements that timed first strikes on engines and last passes on brake vans and coupling points. Engines and last the P-47, thick-skinned and radial-engined, shrugged off the small-caliber ring mounts guarding sidings. Pilots were briefed to hold fire until 300 meters, then open with 2 short bursts and 1 sustained rake, conserving ammunition for a second set of targets within a 5-kilometer radius. On this morning, gun camera reels showed the sight reticles resting on the cylinder block at a 30-degree angle of dive. The exit turn kept speed above 300 knots, lifting the Thunderbolts back under the cloud and along the river. Corridor. Lifting the Thunderbolts, the human lever sat not in the cockpit, but at a map table outside Aldermanbury the previous month. Brigadier General Elwood Pete Quesada, 9th Air Force Fighter Command, had signed an order that shifted priority from top cover escort to interdiction in depth across northern France and the Rhineland. The document reframed the P-47's day, airfields and locomotives before dogfights, points and marshalling yards before boasts over victory tallies. It cited bridges by name and rail hubs by grid, and it set a measurable expectation. Locomotives, not wagons. Engines, not rolling stock. Locomotives, not pilots, were to memorize silhouettes of the standard Kriegslok classes and aim for the joint between boiler and smoke box, where a single, accurate burst could stop a train without expending a full belt. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken at midday on that same 5th of March, Witness Object 1, caught the aftermath at the Gerolstein yard. The prints, studied at 9 power magnification, showed 2 locomotives angled off their tracks, one with a white geyser venting from the ruptured tender, ballast bright where hot metal had scorched frost. To the west, a wagon sat diagonally across a turnout, axles visibly off the chair plates. A blackened rectangle marked the coal stage. The chair plates. The photographic interpreter's grease pencil circled 4 points and wrote a single word: immobile. In the lower margin, a hand added a time: 12:17. The interval from first pass to confirmed stoppage had been less than 5 hours. The repair logs would later show it took 2 days to move the wreckage clear. The Luftwaffe personnel who arrived from a nearby dispersal field at noon expected a routine survey of flak arcs and blast patterns. Instead, they found evidence that the attackers had not even bothered with the sidings or the administratively tempting soft targets. They had aimed with intent to collapse the node. Targets. A captured rail manifest, Witness Object 2 from the previous evening recorded 32 wagons of lubricants and spare parts allocated to a maintenance depot near Bonn. The margin note Über Köln suggested a detour already planned to avoid previous bridge damage. With Gerolstein paralyzed, that detour became a dead end. By dusk, locomotive crews were ordered to cut consists into shorter sections and stage them under tree cover. The order did not address the fact that coal smoke drew straight lines through the forest canopy. The P-47's physicality made this method possible. Its Pratt and Whitney radial was tolerant of small arms hits that might have downed a liquid-cooled engine. The airframe's weight and wing area stabilized firing runs. Pilots reported less buffet when pressing to point-blank range. Maintenance cards, Witness Object 3, from a 9th Air Force service squadron that week listed repeated tire changes and leading-edge patching, predictable costs of low-level work. Yet engine hours remained high, and turnaround times noted in grease pencil on the cards stayed under 3 hours. The logistics chain was keeping pace with the new mission. Authorization built speed. In late February, a memo from Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory's liaison outlined the transportation plan. Strangle rail movement before cross-channel invasion. Quesada's order slotted into that plan, but it pushed lower, literally. His order slotted into where medium bombers would crater yards and bridges, Thunderbolts would prowl the tributaries of the network, cutting engines on the open line and creating ad hoc blockages that yard crews could not bypass with a day's work. The tactical metric was locomotive denial per sortie. In the first week of March, Group After Action reports, Witness Object 4 logged averages of 1 disabled engine for every 2 to 3 aircraft dispatched on rail hunts, with higher rates in valleys where geography funneled trains into predictable sight lines. The reports started to carry grid squares as confidently as they carried enemy aircraft types. German countermeasures were immediate but mismatched. Black Veerling mounts shifted from airfields to rail junctions. Sentries were told to listen for the deep, even note of a radial engine. The assumption had been that enemy fighters would seek altitude and dogfights. Instead, crews saw P-47s arrive at treetop height, ignore decoy wagons, and stitch precise lines into boilers and leading wagons. A decoded signal summary. Witness Object 5 from a Luftgau headquarters the following week complained of fighter bombers focusing on locomotives and requested additional smoke generators and camouflage nets. The summary's final line admitted a constraint. Coal delivery schedules could not be altered without starving other sectors. By mid-morning on the 5th, the valley had absorbed 2 more attacks. One left a half-burned brake van and a string of splintered sleepers across the upline. The other holed a water tower and forced the yard to draw from the river with portable pumps. None of these were catastrophic in isolation. In aggregate, they stressed crews, swallowed daylight, and pushed schedules into night, when blackout procedures slowed everything further. The Luftwaffe team measured flak arcs and marked recommended placements for 2 additional guns. They also measured morale in the faces of railwaymen staring at hissing iron in the frost. The contradiction waited in the afternoon weather. Low scud thickened, and the valley quieted. For an hour, it appeared that the morning's violence had been an aberration, a lucky sweep that would not repeat under heavier cloud. Then, 20 kilometers east at a lesser halt near Nettersheim, another Thunderbolt element appeared out of the same gray ceiling and performed the same surgical sequence. Engine first, coupling second, braking van last. The reconnaissance photographs that evening laid the 2 scenes side by side. The geometry matched too closely to be chance. This was not a pilot's whim. It was a system, and it was spreading. The signature on the order at Aldermanbury did not sit alone. It was spreading. In the last week of February, 9th Air Force Fighter Command circulated a packet whose cover sheet carried 3 crisp lines. Priority rail interdiction. Locomotive denial first. Bridges only when assigned. One annex listed river names from the Somme to the Moselle. Another traced red pencil over marshalling yards at Trappes, Aulnoy, and Namur, and a third summarized ammunition loads as if they were recipes. Armor-piercing incendiary in the outboard guns first, then mix with ball and tracer to bracket a boiler face. Drop tanks standard on outward legs. Jettison at contact to give the Thunderbolts margin for steep egress. A range table clipped to the back. Witness Object 1. Converted map distances into time to target assuming a cruising speed near 300 miles an hour at low level and a headwind off the North Sea. Near 300 miles. It set expectations in minutes and miles, not in abstractions. The apparatus around the aircraft adapted in small, practical steps. Ordnance crews at forward fields began marking belts not for air combat, but for iron and steam. Pilots carried pocket cards with silhouettes of standard German Kriegslock classes, with circles drawn where blast jackets were thinnest. Intelligence clerks shifted from counting enemy fighters over the Ruhr to plotting yard congestion on strip maps. A maintenance officer at an advanced landing ground near Ashford wrote in a margin, Witness Object 2, that tire wear would double if the tempo held. He ordered extra sets that same day and penciled a checkmark beside the requisition number a week. Later, when a lorry left depot with 24, requisition number a week. The smallness of these transactions belied their effect. Turnarounds under 3 hours. Sorties stacked by squadron across the morning. A river valley flown 3 times before noon. The doctrine, written plainly, relied on 5 elements. First, surprise through altitude. Thunderbolts cruised beneath Claude bases and below the acoustic horizon, using river lines and rail cuts as navigation aids. Second, concentration on engines. Destroying a boiler did more to halt movement than shredding wagons. A dead locomotive blocked both ways, and clearing it demanded cranes and time. Third, very short firing windows to conserve ammunition for secondary targets within a 5-mile radius. Fourth, hard egress angles so flak had seconds, not tens of seconds, to track a departing fighter. Fifth, repetition. To track a departing 1 blocked node meant little. 2 nodes within a morning, on adjacent lines, forced dispatchers to push movements into darkness, where blackout rules halved rates. The approach did not require finesse. It required rhythm. Losses were accepted but managed. In squadron after-action pages, Witness Object 3, the column Light Flak Observed lengthened through March, and entries for punctured radiators appeared almost never. The radial engines digested small metal and flew home. The price was paid in scarred leading edges, dinged props, and pneumatic leaks. The ratio of serviceable aircraft stayed above 2/3 most weeks. Ground crews cannibalized landing light assemblies and wheel covers to keep cores flying. Cannibalized landing. On at least one page, a crew chief crossed out escort from a pre-printed line and wrote, Rail Hunt. Resistance and penetration metrics accumulated. A decoded signal summary collated by an Air Intelligence section, Witness Object 4, got a Luftgo complaint in the second week of March that fighter bombers were ignoring yards to cut engines in open country. Smoke generators were requested. Flak trains were ordered to shadow expresses. The reply from a depot in the Rhineland admitted that fuel, coal, and manpower were limited, It committed smoke pots to bridges first, yards second, with open lines left to locomotive crews improvising with whatever smoke they could make from wet coal. The shift in enemy behavior was not theoretical. It was written into German requests and ration sheets. 3 case studies marked the spread and the learning curve. Case 1 began on the Meuse-Sambre corridor in the 3rd week of March. The 365th Fighter Group, recently across from training to operational status, was given a block on the map between Namur and Charleroi. Weather at first light, broken stratus, snow flurries, wind from the west. The group flew in sections of 4, using the river to mask approach, then rising just enough to clear the floodplain trees for a downward rake at engines on the embankment. The objective was not to destroy rolling stock. It was to immobilize locomotives at intervals that created a chain of obstructions before yardmen could dispatch helper engines. The chain of obstruction. By mid-morning, a reconnaissance pair verified 4 disabled engines between Gemep and Auverlay. A rail dispatch log captured by Belgian resistance that evening. Witness Object 5 recorded a change of plan. Passenger traffic suspended on that stretch. Freight pushed to secondary lines south of the Sambre with the instruction to hold it. Daylight if smoke insufficient. The measurable effect was time. Schedules slipped into night, sidings filled, and the following day's tonnage fell without a single bridge being dropped. Case 2 exploited terrain and created a bottleneck that a map did not advertise. Exploited terrain. In early April, with attention fixed on large marshalling yards north of Paris, a 9th Air Force wing tasked one squadron to a line that threaded the Eiffel through a series of shallow tunnels east of Saint-Vith. The pilots received a single instruction: focus at tunnel mouths. They were to fire into the entry, not to collapse the tunnel, but to stop the engine inches before the bore. A stopped locomotive at a hole's mouth turned rock and wood into a lock gate. Aerial photographs developed that afternoon showed one such engine seated squarely at a portal whose keystone was marked with a date from the last century. The photograph's grease pencil circles were almost delicate. Last century. Journal entries from German railway maintenance teams, Witness Object 6, describe the difficulty of recovering a dead engine nose-in. They needed a second engine to pull and a third to shove, and before either could reach the site, the next valley, Hover had its own mouth blocked. The measurable effect was geometry. A pair of black shapes at 2 stone semicircles, quarter of an hour by rail apart, creating a closure that no bypass existed to relieve. Case 3 came when the doctrine met a pivot in German defense. In late May, as Thunderbolt units added zero-length rails to carry small rockets, a Luftwaffe district introduced mobile flak columns to ride rails and defend critical trains. Flak columns. One of these columns, a makeshift flak zug with quadruple 20mm mounts, escorted a prime mover hauling ammunition across the Moselle toward Koblenz. A 9th Air Force group was waiting because a signals intercept, Witness Object 7, marked the departure time in plain language. The Thunderbolts approached in 2 echelons. The first drew fire and climbed steeply, rolling to keep bursts off the canopy. The second dropped below treetops and came in oblique, raking the engine from a diagonal that hid them behind smoke until the last seconds. The flak mounts fired blind when the smoke thickened. Rockets, used sparingly, punctured the tender and a wagon carrying wooden crates. Sparingly, the ammunition did not sympathetically detonate. The engines, hoses, and extinguishers were enough to smother fire. Nevertheless, the train stopped on a metal bridge approach, and that was sufficient. A photograph taken just before dusk showed an engine, 2 wagons, and a flak car crowded onto a straight stretch where repairs and clearance required heavy equipment. The measurable effect was positional. A defended train anchored itself as a blockage at the one place it could not afford to be halted. Authorization and rollout continued in parallel with refinement. Headquarters letters that spring-routed training time to low-level gunnery, not to aerobatic combat. A directive from Lee Mallory's staff aligned targets with a broader transportation plan that counted bridges destroyed per week. But Quesada's pages kept bringing units back to engines. The reason was pragmatic. Bridges rebuilt from prefabricated spans could reopen in days under skilled German railway troops. A locomotive without a boiler could not move itself, and an engine stopped at the wrong place could paralyze two directions at once. Fighter groups experimented with angles of dive and burst lengths. Some units favored a short initial strike to tear through the smoke box seam, and a longer trailing burst to buckle the first wagon's coupler, knowing that a broken link increased the lateral scatter when brakes locked. German countermeasures varied from the elegant to the desperate. Armored caps were welded onto boilers. Painted tarps were stretched over locomotive shapes and sidings, while real engines hid under conifer stands up the line. Flak trains multiplied, at least on paper. Their movement orders, captured in fragment, Witness Object 8, revealed an uncomfortable math. Too few guns for too many routes. Dispatchers tried to bunch trains so escorts could cover 2 or 3 engines at once, but bunching created its own exposure. One blocked road halted all. Smoke pots worked in yards, less so in open country where wind channeled along valleys and cleared decks as often as it cloaked them. Orders pushed departures into deeper night, yet night meant slower running and made schedules elastic. The defenders pursued an enemy that arrived by surprise, fired accurately, and left in seconds. The mid-act contradiction came not from the Luftwaffe but from Allied concerns. French prefects and railway officials complained through channels that low-level attacks were tearing apart infrastructure that would be needed after liberation. A file of translated letters, Witness Object 9, argued for precision against engines and for restraint against bridges serving civilian movement. In parallel, Air Staff analysts noted that cratering yards consumed bombers and munitions, while repair crews proved adept with rails and sleepers. By contrast, immobilized engines stacked into choke points that repair parties could not disperse. Quickly. Yet, there was a cost to precision too. Pilots lingered to confirm kills, and lingering drew flak. Loss rates climbed on certain corridors, particularly where embankments forced predictable approaches. The refinement followed in the next week's orders. No confirmation passes unless weather permitted safe egress. Aim for the seam between smoke box and boiler on the first run. If struck by flak, abandon the secondary target and climb for cloud. Immediately. Supply lines had to feed the tactic. Production tallies from American depots, Witness Object 10, showed an uptick in armor-piercing incendiary rounds shipped to forward airfields and a parallel increase in replacement barrels. Drop tank shipments were prioritized to fields closest to the channel because low-level flight burned fuel faster. A request from Quesada's staff moved a handful of radar beacons closer to likely egress routes to shepherd damaged fighters home under cloud when radio direction finding from England was marginal. None of this was heroic. It was clerical muscle. By early June, rocket rails began appearing under Thunderbolt wings. Rockets were not the centerpiece. Gunnery still did most of the work, but rockets gave tools against defended locomotives and against articulated engines whose castings could shrug smaller rounds. A training circular, Witness Object 11, warned against salvoing a full load at once, recommended pairs against tenders, and forbade firing at bridges without explicit assignment. The circular carried a handwritten reminder: engines stop everything. As the system scaled, patterns became visible to both sides. Pilots learned that certain valleys carried sound longer than others. They approached along ridge lines where trees and rock broke the noise. Dispatchers learned that a morning lull often meant a second wave sweep just before midday. Moving heavy trains in the narrow window between waves became a gamble. Squadron maps showed small pencil ticks where locomotives had been immobilized in previous days, creating mental atlases of hard places where luck and geography had combined. Luftwaffe flak officers answered by shifting guns into those hard places, only to discover that the Thunderbolts were now avoiding them and cutting engines 5 or 10 miles upstream where no guns waited. The 3 case studies repeated an outline across the theater. In Brittany, a pair of locomotives halted at opposite ends of a coastal tunnel, locked an entire peninsula's freight for 2 days while cranes came over land. In the Seine Valley, engines frozen on the approaches to 2 bridges forced detours so long that schedules fell apart before sunset. Near Aachen, armored caps on boilers bought minutes, not immunity, when an oblique dive put rounds into the seam the caps could not cover. The opponent's adaptations underperformed not for lack of effort, but for mismatch. The rail network demanded predictable paths. The hunters did not. The intelligence loop tightened around this pattern. Aerial reconnaissance shifted from photographing damage craters to reading yard behavior. How quickly did cranes move? How many engines stood cold in rows? How often did smoke betray engines hiding under tree cover? How often resistance reports about the train times collated in weekly summaries let staff adjust sweep hours to meet trains mid-run rather than at the terminals. A signals annex, Witness Object 12, tracked German orders that tried to push everything into the small shoulder of time between morning and noon sweeps. The annex recommended sliding one group's takeoff an hour later on alternate days to erase that shoulder. The memo was stamped implemented. Through late June and into July, a second refinement took hold. Rather than seek trains on open lines alone, Thunderbolts began striking feeders to major yards by targeting engines just beyond the last set of points. Engines stopped there could not be bypassed without switching work that consumed the very yard capacity the defenders hoped to preserve. This move straddled Quesada's precision preference and Lee Mallory's yard interdiction logic. It satisfied French complaints by sparing bridges and platforms while still starving yards. A measured effect appeared in captured German throughput tables, Witness Object 13, where inbound tonnage fell sharply on days with multiple feeder cuts, while yard cratering showed a smaller immediate impact. Feeder cuts. The tables were not written to please an enemy. They captured a logistics system under distress. The Luftwaffe continued to send mixed formations against the sweeps when weather cooperated, but air combat was increasingly incidental. Many Thunderbolt sorties saw no fighters at all, yet the rail tally rose. A paradox emerged in signals traffic. German field wings reported fewer dogfights over the Rhineland, even as railway directorates reported worsening delays. Fighters could not be everywhere at once. They chose to be where steam and iron moved. The Luftwaffe command structure, calibrated to air superiority contests, found itself tracking a war measured in line closures and towage orders. By late summer, one more practical note entered unit orders. Avoid engine strikes in town centers when civilians clustered along platforms. Engine strikes in town. This was not a moral footnote alone. It recognized that collateral damage created political friction, and that certain stations could be bypassed to find the same engine a mile beyond, where a stoppage yielded the same delay at lower human cost. A file of French prefect reports, Witness Object 14, thinned slightly thereafter, though not to silence. The rule held: engines over bridges, precision over spectacle, rhythm over single dramatic blows. This system, authorization through a handful of signatures, logistics adjusted by requisition numbers, pilots given plain rules and a map, had taken a bomber escort and turned it into a tool that starved movement. It was not invulnerable. Weather shut it down on some days, smoke and flak bit back. Metal fatigue crept into aircraft that flew low every day. But the observed pattern from March through July remained. Locomotives immobilized in hours, railroads falling behind by sunset, and German orders written in a tone that mixed urgency with exhaustion. The rupture seen at Gerolstein had no reason to remain unique. It became a schedule. The system that began with isolated strikes along the Kell in March did not remain tactical. By June 1944, it had hardened into operational interdiction that supported the largest amphibious operation in history. 9th Air Force summaries listed rail interdiction not in dozens, but in hundreds. Locomotive tallies, once scribbled in the margins of after-action reports, now filled typed columns labeled "Engines destroyed, immobilized." The immediate outcome was a measurable constriction of German movement into northern France in the weeks. Before D-Day. Captured dispatch sheets from German directorates, Witness Object 1, showed daily tonnage across the Seine corridor at barely half of February levels. The documents did not need embellishment. Numbers that once ran to 5 digits fell to 4. The short-term tactical effect was visible on invasion day itself. Luftwaffe fighter cover, already strained, could not reposition quickly. Its squadron sat on airfields that received supplies late or not at all. German armored formations intended as mobile reserves behind Normandy could not assemble at speed. One division was recorded as taking 5 days to move what had been a 2-day rail transit in spring. When Allied reconnaissance counted the tracks, it saw engines cold, lined nose to tail in woods, guarded by flak whose barrels tilted in vain toward contrails far above. On the ground, the Wehrmacht depended on overland marches and requisitioned trucks. The outcome was not annihilation, but attrition measured in lost hours and reduced tempo. The invasion force gained a window to build lodgements before counterattack could reach scale. By late summer 1944, as the Allies advanced through France, interdiction shifted with them. Thunderbolts hunted rail yards across Belgium, then into the Netherlands and Western Germany. Aerial photographs from September, Witness Object 2, showed a yard at Aachen with the locomotives derailed not by direct bombing but by congestion. Engines immobilized days earlier were still being craned from tracks while new arrivals stacked into sidings with nowhere to go. German railway repair teams worked with efficiency born of practice, but throughput tables told the harder truth. Tonnage across the Rhine fell again. The transportation plan's metric was not absolute destruction, but delay. Each immobilized engine achieved that with brutal efficiency. The operational ripple reached further than bridges and timetables. By starving German rail links, 9th Air Force forced resource allocations into defensive repair rather than offensive maneuver. Engineers, cranes, and manpower that might have built new defenses or moved formations to threatened fronts were consumed in the endless work of clearing lines and dragging wrecked engines into fields. A decoded signal summary from October, Witness Object 3, recorded a plea from a German General Staff section for unrestricted priority in coal and parts for locomotives. The plea carried its own contradiction. Priority meant stripping other sectors already short of supply. The rail system, once the Reich's circulatory system, bled time and capacity into a losing cause. The Luftwaffe attempted to recover its role, but the legacy of rail hunts was decisive. Flak trains multiplied but never matched the scale of the threat. Jet aircraft appeared but too late and too few to alter rhythms established months earlier. German doctrine had counted on the permanence of rails as arteries. The P-47 inverted that assumption. Where rails were fixed, aircraft became fluid, striking nodes at will. German defensive adaptation never broke this asymmetry. The result was a gradual collapse, not of a battle line, but of a transportation grid. In the long tail, the legacy was written into doctrine far beyond Europe. Post-war U.S. Air Force manuals cited locomotive interdiction as evidence that air power could paralyze an opponent, not by destroying entire armies, but by freezing their movement. Korea and Vietnam both saw attempts to replicate the method. Low-level fighter bombers assigned not to glamorous air combat, but to routine, grinding attacks on transport. The lesson filtered further into NATO thinking. Cold War planning documents emphasized not only runways and missile sites, but also the disruption of supply networks as decisive in slowing Soviet formations. The Thunderbolts rail hunts became an early demonstration of precision through repetition, a lesson absorbed into decades of planning. The human cost and material strain also shaped legacy. Pilots who flew low remembered flak stitched into wings and canopies. Ground crews recalled endless cycles of replacing tires and patching holes. Losses were not negligible. Yet the ratio of effect to cost was judged favorable enough that interdiction became central in later campaigns. Post-war training included modules on low-level strikes, and aircraft were built with reinforced undercarriages and engines able to absorb damage, echoing the Thunderbolts' rugged design. Even weapons evolved. Rockets became standard, then missiles, offering standoff range for the same function. Immobilize the engine, freeze the line, break the flow. By spring 1945, the rule that had once favored German rail movement had been permanently broken. Locomotive manifests shrank, schedules stretched, and divisions marched where once they rolled. The sight of engines halted nose to tail in valleys was captured in countless reconnaissance frames. One final aerial photograph, taken in March as Allied forces advanced into the Rhineland, showed a small branch line near Remagen. 4 locomotives sat silent, pulled from a wrecked bridge approach and left in parallel sidings, steamless under a late winter sky. In the distance, the Rhine ran low and gray. The photograph bore no annotation beyond grid coordinates and a time, 11:42. The rule had been broken, and the landscape itself recorded the fact.